You have got my biography, and when I find out who wrote it, I'm going to buy them a pint. I couldn't do much better myself. And thank you very much, Tony, for your warm introduction. You said that you were honoured to have me here. I'm honoured to be invited. This is all a new departure from me, attending this event. Ultimately, I was doing the job that I'm paid to do, but the campaigning work that this organisation does, it's those people who really deserve the credit and thanks. So it's an honour to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. My background, or most of my work, is in cases of homicide now, also with a good deal of regulatory offending. And so it was particularly exciting, if you like, and interesting to receive through LinkedIn, whoever thought LinkedIn actually had a real benefit, but it did, a message from a detective constable who I'd worked with probably 10 years earlier in another case, saying that he had a case he wanted me, if possible, to look at. At that stage, no charges had been brought in the case, and Mr. Zaman was under investigation. And if there are unsung heroes in this case, they really are the North Allerton CID. North Yorkshire doesn't have a lot of serious crime. They probably are lucky enough to investigate 1 or 2 homicides a year. They've only recently had a homicide and major inquiry team. This case was picked up by a detective sergeant at North Allerton, which is a small market town in North Yorkshire. His supervisors weren't really very interested in the case. They expected it to just be written off as an unfortunate accident. But Andy Palmer and the rest of his team were of the view that it was much more serious than that. And they really deserve the credit for this case, because they doggedly investigated it over many months with no resources and not a lot of enthusiasm. And they presented a very good case to the Crown Prosecution Service, who then instructed me to advise on whether or not there should be proceedings for manslaughter in this case. And I have to say, when I read the case, I came to the swift conclusion that this was a case that just had to be prosecuted, because I've described it in my slides later on as a recipe for disaster, but it was the perfect storm of circumstances coming together to bring about the death of Paul Wilson. So if ever there was a case that deserved prosecution, win, lose or draw, this was it in my view. And so I gave the advice to prosecute, to charge and prosecute. That was reviewed by the Chief Crown Prosecutor and then by the Director of Public Prosecutions, so no pressure on Wright. But as I say, it was a case, in my judgment, that just had to be prosecuted. That was Paul Wilson with his mum and dad, Keith and Margaret. He was their only son. He was 38 years old when he died. He was in otherwise perfect health. He had a young son himself who he was devoted to. And it's right to say that his death has devastated that family. Paul was diagnosed with a peanut allergy when he was about 7 years old. He'd eaten a marathon bar, they were called then, Snickers they are now, and the allergy had been detected, and his was a severe allergy. He took up work in the catering industry. He was an accomplished chef, so he knew himself very well about food handling and safe food handling. And it's tragically ironic, therefore, the circumstances in which he came to die. But he was very careful about managing his allergy, and he would simply insist that there were no nuts at all in anything that he ordered. And that was his simple recipe in every case, every time that he ordered food. And his mother gave evidence very clearly to that effect. He did not take risks. Keith and Margaret, as I say, devastated by his death, but very dignified people. They really weren't bothered whether we secured the conviction of Mr. Zaman. What they wanted was what the case has achieved: publicity, positive publicity for this sort of campaigning work, in the hope that other deaths and serious incidents could be avoided. So that's Paul Wilson. The other side of the coin, the Indian Garden restaurant, owned by Mohammed Zaman. Mr. Zaman would be described by many as a success story. He came to this country 30 years ago with nothing, and he built up a chain of businesses. He owned 7 or 8 restaurants in and around the York area. One of them was the Indian Garden in Easingwold, which is a small market town. There is no doubt he'd been a successful and was a popular restaurateur. But peek a little bit below the surface, and the recipe for his success appeared to be employing illegal staff, illegal workers who had no right to be working in the United Kingdom, therefore were cheaper, cutting corners, not paying any income tax throughout his entire working life through any of his businesses. So it's unsurprising that it accumulated about £2.5 million in property, but every business bank account that we were able to identify was seriously overdrawn, and he was bouncing checks on suppliers and other businesses left, right and centre, but projecting the image of being a very respectable businessman, winning national awards in terms of his restaurants in the curry industry, and as I say, being able to project himself as being a very responsible businessman. So it was that Paul Wilson had a day off work, and he was working at a pub in Helperby. So he took a taxi into Easingwold, had an afternoon drinking and playing pool with a friend, and then towards the end of the evening he went to the Indian Garden and ordered his meal. I'm very sorry you probably can't see that. I put together the PowerPoint. It was a bad idea. But he ordered his meal. He ordered the chicken tikka masala. It says on the menu, it's one of Mr. Zaman's big points, it says on the menu this dish may contain nuts, but Paul Wilson ordered no nuts. Now, there was an evidential gap because obviously the person who ordered the food was deceased, and we couldn't rely upon as witnesses the waiter who took the order or the chef who cooked the meal, because we formed the view that they were simply dishonest witnesses who were seeking to protect themselves, and the account that they gave when they were arrested and interviewed was just unreliable. In any event, one of them had vanished, and the other one was not willing to engage with the prosecution. But we didn't have any doubt really that he had ordered a meal that contained no nuts, because that is the order slip, and you can see here one chicken tikka masala, and written underneath it by the waiter, no nut. So that was the order that was placed in the kitchen. Any doubt that that hadn't got through to the chef? That was the lid of the meal recovered from the bin at his home, and you can just see on the right there, chicken tikka masala is what I think it's meant to say, and then underneath it, no nut. So we were as confident as we could be that Paul had done exactly what his mum said he always did, which was specify not peanut but no nut, full stop. That had been specified to the waiter, and the message had got through to the chef because it had been written on the top of the container. So Paul picked up his curry and he got in a taxi and he went to the shared house next to the Oak Tree pub where he worked. And very sad piece of evidence on his journey home. He rang his mum, as he always did, because they were very close, and he told her he was going home to have his curry and get an early night because he was up to do the breakfast the next morning. And that was the last conversation that he had. When his housemate came home from work, the house was lit up, the television was blaring, and that was the lounge table with Paul's meal plated out in the lounge, chicken tikka masala and rice, and no sign of his housemate. And that was because Paul had eaten probably a tiny amount of that curry, as we'll go on to see. It was 20% peanut in terms of its composition, and had gone upstairs to try and make himself sick, because that was how he managed his allergy, tended to. But on this occasion, the concentration was so high and his allergy and his reaction so bad that he died on the floor of the bathroom. And his friend discovered him when he came home from work. So there'd been a sudden death, and as I mentioned, a police investigation was launched. And it was an investigation that ran very much in tandem throughout with trading standards. And I think, as a learning point myself from this case, the interaction between trading standards and the police was excellent. It was always a joint investigation, and I was very keen it should be a joint prosecution, with the bringing of regulatory offences together with the criminal offence of manslaughter under one prosecution, because that joined up approach was more likely to secure results. So, trading standards visited the Indian Garden with the police the next day, and I'm sorry, you probably won't be able to read much of this anyway. They left a note of their visit with Mr. Zaman, because Mr. Zaman was there himself. And Mr. Zaman agreed in this first visit that until the circumstances had been investigated, he would simply put a stop on any of his restaurants purporting to serve any nut-free meals. In other words, if a customer came in and said, I've got a peanut allergy or I've got a nut allergy, but I want a chicken tikka masala, the staff were to say, I'm sorry, we cannot serve you, because we cannot guarantee that our food is free of nuts. That was the first visit. This is the day after Paul Wilson was discovered dead at home. Second visit, trading standards came back later that day, discussed this again with Mr. Zaman, and on this occasion persuaded him that he should put up signs, basic signs, which he did, and that says, sorry, we cannot supply nut-free meals. So that was the sign that went up on the 1st of February, the day after Paul Wilson had died. We cannot supply nut-free meals. But a very tenacious trading standards officer, Rob Blacklock, not convinced that Mr. Zaman was really getting the message, sent in a test purchase officer the next day, just in case. And the test purchase officer ordered, this is the day after Paul Wilson had died and Mr. Zaman was aware that he had died as a consequence of eating a meal from his restaurant, ordered a tandoori butter chicken and told the waiter, but I have a peanut allergy and therefore it needs to be free of nuts. So the signs are displayed in the takeaway and he goes in and orders a meal specifying that he has a peanut allergy, and the waiter simply repeated what had happened to Paul Wilson, wrote down on the chit no nuts, and served a meal that even after a death from that very kitchen was still contaminated with enough peanut to kill. So that was the picture that presented itself to trading standards and to the police. Bad enough, you might think, but then the police investigation looked backwards into the history of Mr. Zaman, his kitchens, his ability to serve nut-free meals and the like. And when I said earlier this case represented a perfect storm, I think you'll begin to see why it did, because the history, when you put it together, was just incredible, but not in a good way. So, and I apologise, I've got some of the years wrong. It should all be 2014. I don't know how 2013's crept in. August 2013, that is correct, 2013, Mr. Zaman had been bouncing a lot of checks to a lot of suppliers, and so he had been prevented from ordering by a number of suppliers, but he'd got his house back in order in the summer of 2013 because he'd managed to persuade a different bank to give him a series of overdrafts, which he then ran up to the maximum. And he contacted his supplier, his regular supplier, before his business had been stopped, and he requested a meeting with the rep, Mr. Chilwan. Mr. Chilwan had been his rep for many years and came to visit him at his office in York. And Mr. Zaman was going through his order and was complaining about the price of almond powder and pointing out how expensive it was as an ingredient. And he wanted to know if there was any cheaper alternative, and obviously peanut, groundnut, much, much cheaper. And so Mr. Chilwan explained to Mr. Zaman that he could substitute the ingredients, but first of all, it contained peanut. Secondly, lots of people were allergic to peanut, and therefore if he was going to make the substitution, he had to change his labelling, his menus, and make sure that his staff knew that the substitution was being made, because there was a real allergy issue as a result of the change. Mr. Zaman assured Mr. Chilwan that that is exactly what he would do. In fact, he did nothing, because all of the menus remained the same. They all represented that almond, not peanut, was being used. There was no mention anywhere of peanut. And so anybody who had a peanut allergy but could safely eat almond would be under the completely false impression they could order this dish because it didn't contain peanut, and nobody would have known. On the 3rd of January the next year, a young girl called Ruby Scott went into the Jaipur Spice, which was another of Mr. Zaman's restaurants. Now, Ruby Scott had been fairly recently diagnosed with her allergy, so she's fairly new to managing it, but she specified that she had a peanut allergy, and her and her friends ordered some rice, and they ordered some breads, and they ordered a chicken korma. And she took the meal home, shared it out, and she immediately began to suffer an allergic reaction, because the meal that she had ordered was contaminated with peanut, despite her specifying that she could not eat food with peanut in it. And she was hospitalised. She was fortunately staying with friends whose parents took her immediately to hospital. She was treated in hospital and then discharged. Now, it wasn't just that Ruby ordered the meal. So that should be 14. A day or so later, her mother, again being concerned that the allergy was a new thing to the family, wanting to be sure that it was peanut that had caused the reaction, wanting to be sure that she didn't perhaps have allergies to other food types, rang the restaurant and explained what had happened. And said to them, she ordered a chicken korma, does that dish contain peanuts? And was assured, no, the dish doesn't contain peanuts. We don't use any peanut in our chicken korma. So Ruby orders the meal, then her mother rings up, and Mr. Zaman admitted to the police when questioned that he was well aware of this incident. So this is 3rd, 4th of January 2014. He's been warned by his supplier. He's then put a young girl in hospital, or his food has, and her mother has also rung the restaurant and confirmed that the problem is very much a problem with peanut. So what did Mr. Zaman do? Well, he rang his supplier again, Mr. Chilwan, and we could prove that by analysing his telephone records. He rang Mr. Chilwan a day or so after Ruby Scott had been hospitalised, and he said to him that he was having problems with his customers with this peanut powder, and he wanted to know from Mr. Chilwan, were any other restaurants having these sort of problems? What he didn't say to Mr. Chilwan was, I want to go back to almond and I want to get rid of this peanut powder, or I'm going to change my menus. He just wanted to know, was it just him who was having the problem, or were others also experiencing similar issues? So by about the 5th of January, you might think that Mr. Zaman was on pretty good notice that there was a problem here. Ruby's mum called Trading Standards, and Susan Ayrton, an experienced Trading Standards officer, went into the Jaipur Spice on the 23rd of January, and she made a test purchase. She told the waiter that she had a peanut allergy. She ordered a nut-free meal. The meal that she was served contained peanut in about 5 to 10% composition of the meal. But on this occasion, Susan Ayrton then came back into the restaurant, searched the kitchen, documented procedures. She found no labelling of any containers. She found cross-contamination, so the coconut powder contained peanut, the sugar contained peanut, because the same spoons had been being used throughout the kitchen. And of course this meal with enough peanut to kill anybody who had a peanut allergy. So that's the 23rd of January. This is a week before Paul Wilson died. So Mr. Zaman, told by his supplier that the ingredient he's using is potentially dangerous and he needs to change his labelling. Then he puts Ruby Scott in hospital. Then her mother rings up and raises the issue of peanut allergy. Then Trading Standards come in and find that there is peanut contaminating other ingredients and that they're serving nut-free meals containing significant volumes of peanut. This is a week before Paul Wilson orders his fatal meal on the 30th of January. And then, about 2 in the morning, there was a telephone call from Mr. Zaman's manager at the Indian Garden to Mr. Zaman. First thing the next morning, Mr. Zaman's on the phone to Mr. Chilwan. And this is when, after Paul Wilson had died, he tells Mr. Chilwan, you better get this peanut out of my kitchen. By that time, I might be called cynical, but by that time you might think he was more worried about the police finding it than he was about his customers eating it. And so Mr. Chilwan came over the morning after Paul had died and removed the peanut, or that was what Mr. Zaman thought anyway. Police investigation started later that day. Then Rob Blacklock from Trading Standards visits, he agrees, no nut-free meals will be sold, the sign you've already seen. But then there's the further test purchase, and that further contaminated meal is served. Because, again, all of the ingredients, nothing labelled, cross-contamination throughout the ingredients as a result. Big bag of peanut, completely unlabelled, shoved in a store cupboard in a clear plastic bag. So that was the chronology. And when you look at the case in that way, you can see why I say this was a case that had to be prosecuted if ever any case did for manslaughter, and why, no pun intended, really, this was a recipe for disaster in terms of his customers. Because when we looked at his practices and procedures, and when experts looked at them, in particular Dr. Chan, who you'll hear from later today, we found a litany of failure at every turn in terms of his practices. Nobody had been told that peanut was being used instead of almond, or was being ordered. At least there was no evidence of any communication to any member of staff. There were no written recipe sheets throughout the business at all. So nobody was following the same recipe from kitchen to kitchen, from chef to chef. No ingredients were labelled. Everything in the kitchen was in unlabelled containers. There was cross-contamination, as I've outlined, between the sugar and the coconut and the groundnut, because the same spoons were being used from container to container. Staff training in Mr. Zaman's world involved level 2 food safety course. The course is a multiple choice course. No one in the history of the course had ever failed it, according to the man who administered it. And they spent about 15 minutes dealing with allergies. But to Mr. Zaman, that was sufficient to ensure that all of his staff knew everything they needed to know about allergies. There were no written procedures for handling of allergens at all throughout the business. There were no written kitchen procedures of any kind at all throughout the business. And his workforce was constantly changing and often illegal. So in consequence, no guarantee that these people were trained, and they were changing almost on a daily basis. So one chef could prepare a meal on one day in a completely different way to a chef on another day. Very few of the kitchen staff spoke any English. Many of the waiters spoke limited English, and these are the people who are being relied upon to communicate safely customers' allergy requirements. So that was the picture, and it caused Dr. Chan to remark in evidence, which I was very grateful for, but I hadn't put her up to it. These were her own words, but they were very good. I said, what would your assessment of the business be? And Dr. Chan's answer was, this was a business that was in denial. Because there you had that trail, all these warnings and indicators of what could come. Ruby Scott, Trading Standards visit, the warning from the supplier, and at every turn nothing had been done. I'm just going to read you the first 2 minutes of my cross-examination of Mr. Zaman, because if you want to get a flavour of the sort of business we're talking about, then this really gives you it. I said, Mr. Zaman, can I just try and understand your position about what happened in your restaurant? You say that you're a responsible employer, is that right? And he said, yes. That you've been in business from 1981? Yes. That you've got a vast experience in catering? Yes. That you were well aware of the risk of allergies in the kitchen? Yes. You knew that they could, in some cases, be fatal? Yes. You've been trained by York City Council in 1985? Yes. This was his training. You'd attended training with your staff that covered allergens and the dangers? Yes. And you taught your staff yourself about allergens if they hadn't been trained, is that right? Yes. And you knew and understood that someone with a nut allergy could be killed by eating nuts? That wasn't my understanding, he said. And I said, you didn't know that? I didn't know that mixed nut would kill anybody, he said. So I said, well, let's not worry about mixed nuts. When you were trained in allergies, did you know that people with allergies could be killed if they ate food that contained allergens? Yes. And is it right, you say, because of your vast experience and knowledge, you never cut any corners? No. You didn't look to make any cost saving? No. You took all reasonable precautions to protect your customers? Yes. You exercised due diligence at all times? Yes. But you're a man who's been let down by people at every turn? Yes. By your suppliers? Yes, because he blamed them and said that they'd never told him anything about peanuts. By your manager? Yes, because he blamed his manager and said it was all his fault that he hadn't followed his clear instructions. By your chefs? Yes, because he then blamed his chefs and said it was their fault if they'd served a meal containing nuts. You've been let down by your waiters? Yes, because he said it was all their fault if they hadn't communicated to the chef properly. And it's the fault of those people, not you, that first in June 2013 almond stopped being ordered and peanut was ordered. That's someone else's fault, yes. And it's their fault that a young girl called Ruby Scott was hospitalised on the 3rd of January, yes. And it's their fault that Susan Ayrton was sold a nut-free meal that contained peanut, yes. and it's their fault that Paul Wilson was killed? Yes. And even after that, they carried on serving meals with nuts in? Yes. And then, are you, as Dr. Chan said, Mr. Zaman, in denial? What does that mean? Was the answer. Well, there it is. Even worse, perhaps, he went on to blame Paul Wilson and said, well, if he had an allergy, then why was he ordering a curry in the first place? But that didn't go down very well with the jury, as you can imagine. So that was the factual background, if you like, to the case, and that was the basis on which we decided that we had to prosecute this case. I'm going to very quickly run through how we did that in terms of the prosecution. This case arose before the EU Food Information for Consumers regulation had come into force. And so instead we used the Food Safety Act and charged him with a series of regulatory offences under the Food Safety Act and under the Food Safety and Hygiene regulations. In other words, for selling a meal that on the menu said it contained almond when he knew it contained peanuts, for selling food that was unsafe for consumption to people who had allergies. We did have evidential issues which I've dealt with, the missing and deceased witnesses, but we had the order slip and we had the lid of the curry. Mr. Zaman's defence was that he had exercised due diligence and had taken all reasonable precautions. He had to prove, of course, on the balance of probabilities. The burden shifts to him to prove that he had done that on the balance of probabilities, and that he singularly failed to do, because effectively what he was saying was, I may not have a single scrap of paper to evidence any of the things I'm telling you I did, but you're just going to have to trust me. I told my staff and it's all their fault. That was effectively his defence. And what fundamentally undermined his defence was the Trading Standards Inspector. Because in the aftermath of Paul Wilson's death, he got Mr. Zaman to sign up to a very simple 7-point plan. It wasn't rocket science, it was free to implement, and it was so easy. And it was a 7-point plan that involved simple things like have a written allergy procedure that all staff have read and understand. If you cannot guarantee a meal is free of allergens, do not serve the customer. And these 7 points were all the basics that all reputable businesses would put into place every day. But they enabled us to demonstrate that given Mr. Zaman had been able to implement those 7 things for free and instantly after this incident, he hadn't been exercising anything like due diligence or taking any reasonable precautions beforehand, because he had to accept that these were all reasonable things to do in order to protect his customers. And so from that moment on, really, we had him in terms of the regulatory offences. For the regulatory breaches, the sentence was one of 18 months imprisonment, concurrent with the 6 years for the manslaughter. So these are serious offences and an important tool in the armoury of enforcement. And they were particularly serious in his case because he'd had all these warnings, one after another. The cumulative position had built up. The supplier had told him, Ruby Scott, Susan Ayrton, and then Paul Wilson. Gross negligence manslaughter is a curious beast as a criminal offence. There are 4 elements that we had to prove. First, that he owed a duty of care. My principal concern when I gave advice on the case was whether or not we'd be able to establish that, because there wasn't a previous instance of somebody being prosecuted for manslaughter in these circumstances. But I was certain that we would be able to establish he owed a duty of care, the supplier of food to the customer and consumer of it, and that was not argued. It was agreed as a matter of law that he owed a duty of care, and the jury was directed that he owed a duty of care to Paul Wilson. Did he breach the duty? Well, we were able to rely upon the regulatory offences to show that chronology and paint that picture of all these this cumulative warning that had built up over several months leading up to the death of Paul. In other words, he knew how serious this was. He knew he'd hospitalised somebody else. He knew his kitchens were failing. And I think what sealed his fate was that he admitted that after Susan Ayrton had conducted the test purchase, he knew that there was a serious problem in his kitchens, and the only way to deal with it was to remove peanut. And so he told a lie and said that he'd ordered his managers and chefs to remove all peanut from the kitchen. We know that was a lie because he had no credibility at all, and because there was still peanut in all of his kitchens after that date. So proving a breach of duty in the end was not too difficult. Causation, well, there was no doubt that this meal killed Paul Wilson. And in terms of gross negligence, this is where manslaughter in these circumstances is a very unusual offence. It is up to the jury as to whether what the person did should be characterised as a crime. They look at all the circumstances and decide, is this so serious that it ought to be criminal conduct? But again, it was that cumulative build-up of warnings that gave us the resolve and allowed us to argue, well, what could be worse than what this man has done? He had opportunity on opportunity on opportunity. He didn't take any of them. And that's why this should be a criminal offence. So, very quickly, simple lessons to be learned. Consider and record changes of ingredients. Communicate to your staff. Ensure adequate training and maintain records of it. There wasn't a scrap of evidence about any training in Mr. Zaman's businesses. Produce written recipe sheets and make sure that they're followed. Label ingredients. Eliminate cross-contamination. Produce written procedures for all aspects of allergen-related issues, from front of house to food preparation, and ensure that they're followed. Don't guess. The simplest of all. Don't offer empty assurances, as Mr. Zaman did. And if in any doubt, don't serve the customer. Because as he accepted, if his staff had just said to Paul Wilson, we can't guarantee that, sir, he wouldn't have ordered the meal and he'd still be alive today. And then monitor and enforce compliance amongst your staff and record the fact that you've done that. Having records is very important. That's a bit of shameless self-promotion with which I end. Thank you very much indeed.